Hello and welcome to session 4 of The Path of Loss. My name's Ollie Doyle, and I want to start by just reminding you and me of a couple of core principles of the process that we're undertaking. The first core principle is that this path is not about gaining something. It's not about what we become. It's about what we overcome. It's about putting down everything that doesn't serve us and just being left with what does, which is why I call it the path of loss. The second guiding principle that we need to have is simplicity. It's vitally important to our practice that we keep things simple, because the storyteller wants to complicate things. It wants to spin a big narrative web around what you're doing, what it means, where you're going, and whether you're getting there fast enough. And in that web of complication, of course, we can lose ourselves for many lifetimes if we get more than one. So if we remember that it's a continual putting down, a shedding of the false, and that our process to do this must be simple. Keep those two things at the front of our practice, and we'll be okay. Now today's session is about losing imagination, or shedding it as our reality. And I don't mean that we're going to become unimaginative. That won't happen. But shedding imagination means setting down all that is unreal. And when I define what's unreal, you're going to be shocked. You're going to be surprised that I define so much of my own inner experience and yours as unreal, as imagination. So I'm going to define imagination really clearly, and you'll see where I'm coming from with this definition. Well, a few years ago, I was happily traversing this path, and my main approach was just to feel the breath and feel the body, as we've discussed, and just meditate. And that was my whole approach. And I was pretty happy with that, and things seemed to be going pretty well. And as I did that, I discovered that many thoughts were untrue. So many things that my mind said were not actually factual as I believed them to be. And I remember once when I was having some real difficulty with someone at work, and my mind was spinning all these stories about what kind of person they were and what I should do about it, and all of these things that come up. And it just got more and more complicated, and the more that I tried to return to the breath, the more the storyteller spun these yarns, as we call them in Australia, about this situation, adding layer upon layer of complexity. And it got to a point where, I've just felt sick about it. And maybe you've been in a situation like that too, where you feel so overpowered by that mental complexity, so worn out by thinking about it that you don't even want to go to work, or you don't want to face your partner, or you don't want to, see that person or experience that thing that seems to be causing your unhappiness. And of course, all of us, or all of you listening, know that nothing outside causes that unhappiness. It's something inside that creates that. And I was seeking a good solid answer to this, and I just couldn't find anything that really explained what was going on. Now, I knew the thoughts weren't true, and they were just, superimposed judgments about situations. But I just couldn't seem to shake them, and I didn't know why. And I was listening to a podcast of Byron Katie one day, and she was questioning, she has a really great process of asking these questions when people bring their painful thoughts to her, and she just runs through these really simple questions. And this man was in great pain about a situation that had happened in his past, a terrible assault that had left him, damaged physically and psychologically. And, he told his story as people do, and then she asked him this question, the first question that she asks. And the first question that she asks, for people who aren't familiar, is it true? So people bring that thought, and she asks them, is that thought true? But there are a few ways to do that. And, this man's thought was that I'm sad because I was, beaten and abused. And I thought she would question it by asking, is it true that you shouldn't have been abused and beaten? And what she asked instead was, you were beaten and abused. Is that true? And when I heard her say that, I almost had to pull the car over. I was driving on this straight country road that we have in Australia. And I almost had to stop because it just hit me, this wave of confusion about, well, how could she ask whether the experience happened or not? You were beaten and abused. Is that true? Well, clearly for him, it is. And his answer was yes. And she said, you were beaten and abused. Can you absolutely know that that's true? And there was a silence as he sat with that question. And the answer he came back with was no. And I thought, that's interesting. So how can this be? This is part of his experience. And of course I know that arguing with what's happened causes pain and suffering, and we can't say that something was definitively good or bad or should or shouldn't happen. But how can he say that it's not absolutely true that this happened? And there was this pause after he answered. And she just said, right, in this moment, where is that beating? Where is that assault? And he said, it's in my mind. And she said, who is getting assaulted? Is it you, or is it an image of a person in your mind? And he said, it's an image. And then she said, and apart from that image, which is just an image in your mind, is there any proof that this actually happened? And he answered no. And in that moment I did pull the car over, and I just sat for a few minutes, because it suddenly struck me that as soon as something is, in the moment that something's happening, I could say, this is happening, and it would be true. Maybe that's not the right word, but let's stick with that for the moment. But as soon as that moment is past, then I have no proof of its existence. It only exists in imagination. So even if I remember speaking some words to you all a few minutes ago, I have no proof in this instant that this is true, that it actually happened. And so when we argue with reality, the point that she made, when we argue with reality, it's not really reality that we're arguing with. We're arguing with an image in our mind. We're arguing with words and pictures arising in mind. Now, up until recently, those things that we call memory were seen as fairly reliable, as fairly accurate representations of our experiences. But scientific studies over the last probably 15 or so years have shown really clearly that human memory is incredibly unreliable. That, for a start, we only pull a tiny thread of our experience into conscious memory. And even that tiny thread is so warped by our existing beliefs and conditioning that it does not, even a few hours or days afterwards, it does not represent, what you would see if there was a camera stuck on your head that was taking in pretty well what your eyes and ears took in. But here's where it gets really crazy. Even if our memory was 100% accurate, there is no way that we could say that what's arising in mind is real or represents reality, because it's still just words and pictures. And so, if we keep moving from here, every story that we tell ourselves is pure imagination. Everything that we call my life or my year or my character or my experience is imagined. And therefore, everything that we get angry about or sad about or stressed about is only a picture in mind. So let's take a moment to breathe together, feel the breath. And just for a few minutes, let's make a conscious effort to just turn attention away from anything that is imagined. So we can feel the breath. But as soon as one breath is finished, it moves into imagination, and we need to disregard it. So we need to stay with this instant of this breath. Any story that you hear about what I said 10 seconds ago is imagination. So let's disregard that too and just come back to this instant of this breath. And if emotions are arising in the body, then any word that we use to label that emotion is imagination too. It's a story. That feeling is anger, that feeling is sadness. The truth is we really don't know. So whatever emotions are arising in the body, see if you can experience them without imagination getting in the way. So I learned something critically important from Katie that day, which I still often forget. And what I was faced with in that moment was a clear choice. Do I continue to live as if those those imaginings were true, and then try to deal with their impacts, which is what I was doing? Or do I cut them off at the root and recognize them as false in the first place, which then removes the need to deal with them? Because it takes their power out from underneath them. If we know they're just shadow puppets on the wall, they won't frighten us. If we think there's a real monster about to come in the door, then we need to deal with it, or we need to convince ourselves that it's not a monster. But if we know that it's all false, then there's nothing to be done. And that's a choice that I have to come back to at times when stress takes over, because the mind continually runs back to that complication, and I start to believe in those imaginings again, and that's when life gets difficult. Because I start to carry around this story and past and future and what I need to do. reality, none of it can be proven to exist. And that sounds a little bit lofty maybe, but it's really practical and simple in that every story is untrue. Every word is imagined. And in reality, we don't know anything about what this means, what we see and hear means. We put meaning on top of it through words. The meaning doesn't come out of what we see. So practically what we do with that is what we've already been doing. We sit, we breathe, we feel the body. But we can add another dimension of inquiry to that practice, which is to examine those stories when they arise and see, is there any evidence, concrete evidence now that proves them the reality of those stories, or are they just figments of my imagination? And if we use that real scientific method to test and to say anything that can't be proven needs to be held as untrue for the moment, then and we can do some really deep exploration internally really quickly. So hold your mind to a high standard of proof, beyond reasonable doubt. And as you go through this week, don't worry so much about dealing with the outcome of the false. Start by checking whether it has any provable reality or not. Now I've talked too long, so thank you for listening. And I hope this has been clear enough to be of use on your path. And I look forward to continuing this journey together next week. Thanks for listening to The Path of Loss, Session 4.